can't whistle.
Here, just pretend like you're whistling.
You gotta leave that in.
How?
I think it'd be funny, like, as the, you know.
Is the cold open?
Yeah.
We'll try it out.
We'll try it out. We'll give it a little shot.
We'll see.
Hello, and welcome back to the Conspiracy Couple podcast. I'm Marisa.
And I'm Ethan.
And today we are back with part 2 of our 5 families / New World Order, kind of, conspiracy episode. If you haven't watched part 1 yet, I would suggest that you do that because it is important to get that background information.
You gotta hear about the first 2 families.
You have to hear about the first 2 families. You cannot just listen to 3, 4,
It's not the 3
and 5.
families.
Yeah.
It's the 5 families.
Yeah, you can't just listen to 3, 4, and 5. You have to listen to 1 through 5.
Yep.
So, of course, make sure you're following us on all of our socials. Follow us on Instagram at Conspiracy Couple. Follow us on TikTok at Conspiracy Couple Podcast. And if you are not already watching, subscribe on YouTube, like the video, leave a comment, and turn on post notifications. We would love to hear from you guys. And the comments are a great place to leave your opinions on the topics. And of course, share us on your socials. Leave us a 5-star review on your streaming platform of choice so that your friends can also hear about these 5 families. So, Ethan, any housekeeping updates before we get into it? No. Okay. Well, we are going to dive right in, but first we have a short message from our friends over at the Till Death Do Us Part podcast.
Hello, I'm Melissa.
And I'm Daniel, and we are from Till Death Do Us Part podcast.
A podcast where I share my interest in true crime with my husband.
But I could honestly care less.
But here's the kicker. I only tell Daniel cases of seemingly loving and perfect couples.
They always say that, don't they?
They do. But behind closed doors, these relationships are not at all what they pretend them to be.
And yes, we tend to be super judgy about other people's relationships because it makes us feel better about our own.
Honestly, who hasn't ever thought of murdering their significant other?
I know we have.
Maybe on vacation.
A cruise ship, perhaps?
What about some nice poison in your coffee?
Sounds delicious.
Or just a tried and true accident?
Carbon dioxide, anyone?
Join us every Tuesday as I tell Daniel the story of a relationship that has ended in a horrific fashion, whether that be murder or just attempted murder.
If you like dry humor, snarky banter, and listening to an old married couple get on each other's nerves,
then you'll love us. So remember, be careful.
For marriage is a life sentence.
And divorce is always the better option.
Okay, so we are back, and last week we discussed the Rothschild family and the Rockefeller family. And so if you don't remember, that leaves us with the Morgans, Duponts, and the Bush family. So we are going to start with the Morgan family. So the Morgans and the Rockefellers have historically been friendly with each other. You could say they're besties.
Huh.
I mean, I don't know if they're besties, but you know.
But you could say it.
You
if
could
you
say
want.
it. I'm sure maybe one of the family members of each family has been a bestie with another one. But the families have historically been friendly with each other. So the first Morgan that kind of put them on the map was John Pierpont Morgan. And so you might think J.P. Morgan. We'll call him J.P. Morgan.
Oh, what is he from?
J.P. Morgan Chase.
Oh, that's right. That's right.
So he was the son of a banker, and he followed in his father's footsteps. And he entered into the financial world himself. And he ended up founding J.P. Morgan and Chase. And I'm sure you've heard about that because it's a big company. So in 1893, J.P. Morgan, or John Pierpont Morgan, exchanged gold for money with foreign investors to help the government out and to also restore faith in the U.S. economy. So at that time, there was a lack of trust with the economy of the United States, and so he was trying to help people have that goodwill. Of course, about 40 years later, then the Great Depression happened. So that goodwill in the U.S. economy didn't last very long. So in so doing, he came to control all of the U.S.'s gold. And after this, they began using that gold and money to finance many of the big companies in the country, such as AT&T, and General Electrics. So not only did he have JP Morgan and Chase, which was a huge, huge industry in the world of American finance, but he also had these big industries. And something that he was known for was building his empire on exploiting poorer workers. And basically being the example of why we need minimum wage and workplace safety. So he was known for being very cruel. He was known for being very cruel to his employees, not paying them fairly, and not having safe environments where they could go to work.
Not great.
And so there were a lot of injuries and deaths that occurred, but he would always just go find someone else. And you may also remember the name J.P. Morgan from our episode on the Titanic.
Nope.
Okay. So we discussed how people believe that the Titanic sinking was an intentional act rather than an accident. And earlier we discussed how the Rothschild family was blamed as possibly being behind the sinking in order to get rid of opposition to the Federal Reserve. So apparently the three men who were targeted were also rivals to J.P. Morgan.
Were they actually, though?
Apparently.
Because the last ones weren't.
Here's the thing. It's the same three men.
Interesting.
It's the same three men. Benjamin Guggenheim, Isidore Straus, and John Jacob Astor.
I'm surprised you actually just remembered that off top.
I am surprised I did too.
She didn't read that off the notes.
No, I remembered it. So Morgan owned the Titanic. He was the one who owned the Titanic.
Oh.
And this theory kind of rests on the fact that he was planning on going on the Titanic, but changed his mind at the last minute.
I'm remembering him now.
Yes. And people thought it was very suspicious that the owner of this, like, huge groundbreaking boat would not go on the maiden voyage.
Groundbreaking, but not ice-breaking.
It was not ice-breaking, in fact. And they were like, what's the deal here? This is a big deal for you. Like,
Right.
That's like if you had a movie premiere and the director didn't go.
Right.
And so he, who was going to be on it but changed his mind for whatever reason, survived while these other three men passed away. And the problem with this theory is that no one knows exactly how Morgan got the crash to occur, how he ensured that the crash would occur, and then how he would ensure that those three men would perish. Because even though they were men, and it was, okay, you evacuate women and children first, they were wealthy men.
Right.
And
rules don't apply to wealthy men.
that's right. Rules don't apply to wealthy people. And so even though the idea is we have limited lifeboats, women and children leave first, well, if you're a wealthy guy who has control of this industry, you would probably be put on one of the first boats.
You're like, they're first, but you're like 0.5.
Yeah. So that was his big theory was whether or not he caused the Titanic to crash. His companies also funded a lot of Nikola Tesla's research. And during his life, J.P. Morgan was able to take control of a large part of the banking industry, as well as the railroad and steel industries in the United States.
I'm noticing a connection between these families and the banks.
How do you control a group of people? You control their money.
Yep.
So he was on the board of directors for 48 different companies and was a member of many very influential social clubs. And those social clubs had a lot of really wealthy and powerful people as members along with him. And this gave him not only extensive industry influence, but also political influence. And many people believe that the Morgan family was actually responsible for pushing the U.S. to get involved in World War I in order to protect the loans they paid to Russia and France prior to the war. So people also believe that they prompted the U.S. to enter World War II as well by somehow influencing Japan to attack Pearl Harbor by promising them a portion of any profit that they accumulated from selling supplies to the military. And the Morgan family still owns the biggest reserve of gold in the country. So if you're noticing a theme, you mentioned that there was a theme between the banks and having control of money and finances. Have you also noticed that there's a theme between encouraging and profiting off of war?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. So when you think of World War I and World War II, these were horrific tragedies.
Yeah.
It not only led to the deaths of millions of American citizens in combat,
Well,
but
not just Americans.
well, if we're thinking like purely from an American
Oh,
standpoint,
okay.
but millions of people worldwide in combat, it also led to collapses of many economies.
Yeah.
And it led to a lot of people being desperate for things like food and income and supplies. And it changed a lot of, how the world worked. In World War II, it led to women getting into the workforce because there weren't enough men to work. And so they had women come in. There were people who didn't have food. You were having like famines worldwide.
Yeah. It was like world-altering events.
Right.
Yeah.
And so the idea that these companies are promoting war to get money or to...
Pretty horrific.
Yeah. Also, you have to think the Morgan's children, their Morgan's sons, aren't going to be drafted.
Right.
So, like, let all the normal poor people go fight, and we'll just make money by selling the equipment to the military.
Yeah.
And you also have to think, if you're selling equipment to the military, and if you're financially profiting off of wars, what is in it for you to stop the wars? And if you have this influence on different nations,
Yeah.
like, so for example, if they were able to influence Japan to attack Pearl Harbor,
Right.
that's what got America to enter World War II.
Yeah.
Before, they were not in it.
Right.
So, if you are having this influence on both countries, you're selling goods to both countries, you're not going to want to support the countries having a truce.
Right.
Because then, well,
The war's over. You're
war's
done
over.
making
I'm not
money,
selling
yeah.
money anymore. I'm not selling goods
Not
anymore.
selling money.
I'm not selling my money anymore.
Don't sell your money. It's not good financial advice.
And they were making money off of wars. They were potentially encouraging countries to enter into wars, which had some pretty horrific,
Yeah.
results. And we know that Morgan himself was known for exploiting poor people to get what he wanted.
I can sense that this war profiteering is going to come up again. I'm sure in the Duponts, but definitely in the Bushes.
We'll see. And apparently the Morgan family, like I said, still has the biggest reserve of gold in the country. And especially at a time where we see inflation, I'm sure you hear a lot of people talk about how important it is to have, like, your assets diversified with the gold. So if they own the biggest reserve of gold, and they also control financial institutions, there you go.
It's a lot of money.
It's a lot of money. So now we move on to the Dupont family. So the first member of the Dupont family to begin the dynasty was the son of a French immigrant named Eleuthère Irénée Dupont. And his father had immigrated to America during the French Revolution because their family was aristocratic. And if you know anything about the French Revolution, they did not treat the aristocrats great. They usually were lining them up to the guillotine. And so him and his family moved to America. So Eleuthère started a gunpowder factory in Delaware. And that's how they initially grew their wealth. And they also gained their wealth in the industry of manufacturing industrial chemicals and military munitions. So their business, like I said, initially was making gunpowder, and they quickly became the biggest supplier of gunpowder for the military because of their friendship with then President Thomas Jefferson. And they then moved to producing dynamite for the military, which was incredibly successful as well. And in 1803, they entered into the world of political influence. As I said, they were friendly with Thomas Jefferson by supposedly helping the U.S. ensure that they would be able to purchase Louisiana from Napoleon. So they were able to kind of help those negotiations along. So their monopoly, again, was broken up in the early 1900s, but they are still in charge of a huge majority of global munitions. And their businesses supplied about 40% of the munitions used in World War I by the Allied forces. In World War II, the government needed help producing plutonium for the Manhattan Project, which, as we know, created the atomic bombs that ended the war. And the Dupont family created and financed a top-secret plutonium manufacturing base to help supply the government and military with what they needed and to keep the Axis forces from discovering what they were working on. So they supplied the majority of the munitions in World War One. In World War II, they helped the government produce the supplies needed to create the atomic bomb. And they further helped in the 1950s during the Cold War to help America build the hydrogen bomb after the Soviet Union exploded their atomic bomb, so that the country could have a leg up on the Soviet Union in the case a war would break out. Of course, each time they were generously rewarded by the government for their assistance. So we know that they helped the government in war financially and, providing materials. But many people have blamed the Dupont family for being responsible for banning hemp and cannabis in 1937. And that was to protect their nylon manufacturing company and to keep the hemp manufacturing from encroaching on their territory. So think of all of the things that have happened as a result of hemp and cannabis being illegal.
Okay. Yeah.
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 Yeah. So all of those people who have gone to prison over cannabis charges or any of that kind of thing, people believe that the Dupont family was behind this. We know that they were friendly with President Thomas Jefferson, and we know that they have helped the government in 3 major wars. So the idea is they have, the power, the influential power to make something illegal for a strictly business reason. It is believed that their influence was so big that they were the only reason the government made the decision to ban it.
Wow.
However, many people believe that if they saw hemp as this big threat to their manufacturing, they would have just found a way to get involved in the manufacture of hemp themselves to gain that revenue instead of outlawing it.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But there are people who think they were the only reason it was outlawed. So the Dupont family has also come under fire when it came to light that they had been spilling chemicals from their plants into the waters surrounding the plants, poisoning the water and leading to the death of local livestock.
Yeah, that's not good.
So a movie was made about this, and it was called Dark Waters. So the plant in question, I'm going to kind of get into this because I thought it was really interesting, and it kind of gets into theories about, the water supply. So the plant in question, or the plants in question, were producing Teflon, like non-stick pans.
Yeah.
So that was huge in the 50s and 60s. Non-stick pans. Because that was groundbreaking. They didn't have that. Like, we take it for granted, like, okay, I have my non-stick pan. They didn't have it back then. So the chemicals used in the production of Teflon are called forever chemicals. Because they are highly toxic and are unable to ever be broken down. So all of these forever chemicals were dumped into the rivers around the factories instead of being properly disposed of. So there are laws surrounding how biohazards need to be disposed of. Dumping the biohazards into the river is not one of the ways.
Are you sure?
Yes.
All right.
So as we know, if there are chemicals that don't get broken down and those chemicals go into the water, it goes into the livestock that we eat, the plants that we eat, the water that we drink, and ultimately it gets into us. So I saw a statistic. It was on a biography video about this chemical scandal, and it said 99.7% of people alive today have traces of this chemical, which is called C8 or PFOA.
Wow.
In our systems currently.
That's not good.
And this leads to, obviously, increased risks for certain kinds of cancer. The 2 that the video highlighted were testicular cancer and kidney cancer. So, at the time, the government did not recognize C8 as a dangerous toxin. However, the DuPont company knew that it was dangerous to people if not disposed of properly. So, think of, how many things come out into the marketplace and they're poorly researched, and then the government comes back and is like, oh, this is toxic. I think of the supplement industry.
Yeah.
So the supplement industry is kind of like the Wild West. It is not regulated by the government unless something comes up that's like a lawsuit or unless there is a provable risk. So a lot of things like vitamins, protein powders, energy drinks, they have a lot of things in there that are not safe, but the government will not say that they're safe because there is not a definitive linking that to being unsafe.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of how this was. The government didn't recognize it as unsafe because he didn't have any proven bad results, but DuPont knew. Hundreds of thousands of tons of chemicals were deposited into the Ohio River during the heightened production of Teflon. So, why did they dump it in the water instead of disposing of it properly? Because it's cheaper. It's way cheaper to just dump something into the water versus taking it to a plant and burning it. So, in 1961, after the production...
It's cheaper to not do your taxes. You still gotta do them.
That's true. It is cheaper. Anyways, that just brought down the mood significantly. I'm just thinking every year we do our taxes and the checks we have to write.
Anyway.
Like, so in 1961, after the production of Teflon and the dumping of the C8 had already been underway for years, scientists at DuPont started doing secret experiments to see how harmful the chemicals were on animals and humans. And the results showed that PFOA, or C8, was extremely dangerous. They even observed their workers to see how they responded and in relation to how close they were to the chemicals. After testing their workers and seeing elevated levels of PFOA in their bloodstreams.
Did they, after they discovered this, did they stop?
No. So, listen to this. They also knew that PFOA had caused birth defects in rats. So if they had an employee who was pregnant, they would just move them off the floor and put them in a different part of the factory and observe them and observe their babies after they were born to see if they had birth defects. And apparently 2 out of 7 babies that were born had eye defects.
Oh my gosh.
But DuPont denied any involvement. So this is the 60s that they're doing these experiments.
Mm-hmm.
So we're going to jump to the 90s.
Oh, 30 years later, huh?
Yes. So in the 90s, a farmer in West Virginia noticed that he saw 2 dead deer and dead cows near a river. And these animals had blood running out of their noses and out of their mouths in a way that was indicative that they had had some hemorrhaging in their brains that led them to pass away. If you're watching on YouTube, we have another member of the family with us now. Domino. She would like to hear about this.
Yeah, she's very interested. She woke up from her nap.
Yes. So, this farmer notices these 2 dead deer and dead cows near the river, and he also had noticed that his own cows were dying. So he reported that 153 out of his 600 cows had died in the exact same way, and that all of the cows had access to the same river. And prior to that, his brother had recently sold 66 acres of land to DuPont, and the river his cows were drinking from was upstream of a DuPont plant. So, nobody in town would help him. The vets wouldn't help him, the doctors wouldn't help him, the pastors wouldn't help him, no one would help him. And he had to reach out to an environmental lawyer. So the lawyer was able to trace the poison to the DuPont plant, and then filed a lawsuit against the company.
Wow.
So they were
doing it for 30 years.
Mm-hmm.
Jeez.
Yeah. So they were able to prove that the cows had drank water that was contaminated with PFOA and that it was in the water supply for public drinking in the area. She's about to drink your water. Hi, Dom.
I said public drinking?
Come on, Dom. Okay. So throughout the course of the lawsuit, it became clear that the PFOA was causing people to get cancer. Not just causing the livestock to die, but causing people to get cancer. And that DuPont knew that this was a risk of PFOA.
Jeez.
And continued pumping it. So what they did, as a result of this lawsuit, was change the chemical composition of PFOA just slightly into a different chemical, and created a new company to take over the manufacturing plants, and distance themselves from the DuPont company and scandal. So essentially, it was the same chemical. They just changed a little bit, and then they changed their name, and that's that.
Awful.
So DuPont merged with Dow to make Dow DuPont, and is worth about $130 billion today.
Wow.
So that begs the question. We know that it was killing animals. We know that it can cause defects. We know that it can cause cancer. It kind of begs the question of, like, what is in our water? What are these people putting in our water, either intentionally or unintentionally?
What's in there?
So that is obviously very nefarious. And you have to think, they were pumping it for 30 years.
30 years that they, like, where they knew it was bad.
And they were doing experiments on their employees and on animals to prove that it was bad. And then finally they get confronted about it, and they just change the composition of the chemical.
Terrible.
So it kind of is like, what's in our food, what's in our water?
Yeah.
Let's just say that it's purely financial and they're just doing it because they're cheap and they want to save a couple bucks on the processing. That's bad.
Yeah.
But then you have to think, what kind of person knowingly infects people, knowingly puts chemicals into something that will kill people? And what are they doing now?
Yeah.
Are they still doing it? What are the what is on our bodies right now?
Yep. The fact that they were aware enough to run experiments, and then when those experiments turned up and they were like, it's not good, they just continued doing what they're doing, is just, that's so bad. That's so bad.
And it does kind of make me question, like, is there, I mean, we can do a whole episode on water, but, like, is there something in the water that is meant to make us sick, that is meant to, make us more dependent on the government, that is meant to make us stupider, or, like, that kind of thing? I mean, you think of big pharma, and you think of how many people are on so many medicines nowadays, and you're like, is that intentional? Like, are all these companies working in it together? Like, why would they want a sicker population? Wouldn't you want a healthier population to be able to go out and work, to be able to go out and stimulate the economy? Why would you want people to be sick? Unless it's, sick people are easier to control. So it kind of makes you have that question in your head. And something else the Dupont family is known for is something that we mentioned in the Rothschild family, which is inbreeding. So the children were encouraged to marry their cousins to ensure, quote, honesty of soul and purity of blood. Otherwise, the goal was to keep the bloodline pure.
What does that mean, to keep the bloodline pure?
Honesty of soul and purity of blood.
What does that mean?
It means that you're not marrying out to people who you don't know their bloodline, I guess. I don't know. It's the same thing we talked about with, like, the Egyptian deities and, like, the royal family. You want to have, like, this...
I'm just saying, I'm not saying, but I'm saying,
Yes. So, of course, this created, like, a very insular group. Like, they all kind of lived in the same place, and they all married their cousins. And the problem is that there were some issues that were coming about in the children due to this practice. People were starting to get birth defects. That happens when you marry your family members.
Yeah.
And so they had to put a hamper on that practice because they realized that keeping the blood pure doesn't actually keep the blood pure. It definitely doesn't keep the chromosomes pure. That's for sure.
No, it does not.
So currently, the Dupont family is the biggest producer of GMO seeds and pesticides. And their company is in direct competition with the controversial company Monsanto. So, okay, maybe that word doesn't, like, strike as much vitriol, like, emotion into you as it does for me, because I have done a lot of reports and such on GMO and specifically on Monsanto.
I have literally no idea what Monsanto is.
This is what happens when you're a food scientist. You do a lot of reports on Monsanto and you think it's, like, common knowledge. But Monsanto is, like, a big producer of, like, GMO corn and GMO, like, produce. The Dupont family also owns Doomsday Treasury, which is a place where samples of every plant on Earth is stored in the event that they need to be replanted following an apocalypse.
Interesting.
So some people might say that instead of preparing for an apocalypse, they're preparing to create an apocalypse so they can swoop in and save the day with all their plants. And I'm sure you've heard of the concept that whoever controls the food controls the people. I'm really into gardening, and I heard someone who also is really into gardening, and she said if you don't learn how to grow your own food, you will always be dependent on the government.
Yeah.
If you don't learn how to grow your own food, obviously, like, we have a tiny garden because we live in an apartment. Subscribe and help me get a bigger apartment so I can have a bigger garden. But if you can't grow your own things, if you cannot supply your own food, then you will be at the whims of the people who can. And so in an event such as an apocalypse, the Dupont family would have a significant advantage in amount of control over the population, as well as getting to decide who gets what food.
Yeah.
And of course, there are also theories about, GMO foods. And do you know what GMO is? GMO foods, if you don't know what it is, it's genetically modified. So you think of like, okay, I went and I planted lettuce. That's not the same as genetically modified, where they make it in a lab and then plant it. And of course, when we talk about pesticides, we know that pesticides are bad for the environment.
Yep.
If you spray pesticides on your garden or on your grass, please stop. I am begging you. We know that it is bad for us. We know that it is bad for animals. It is gonna get in the water supply. We know it causes cancer.
Just don't do it.
Just don't do it. We know it causes cancer. If your grass is brown, that's okay. Just water it. Anyways, that was my rant on pesticides. But we think of like purposely poisoning the population and the idea of controlling the food. The Dupont family controls the food.
Yeah.
They have poisoned the water. They might be poisoning the food supply with pesticides and GMOs. And they also have a huge, huge, huge amount of military power. So I personally think that the Dupont family is one of the most sinister families on this list.
Wow. Heard it here first.
Because they have all of that influence. I mean, financially, they're very wealthy. They have made a lot of money giving the government weapons of mass destruction. And we know that they poisoned the water. And when they were confronted with that, after they'd already been doing it for 30 years, after they already knew the results, they just changed the name. They changed the name of the chemical. They changed the name of the company. They have a huge stake in GMO seeds. In the event of an apocalypse, they have the power to plant the food and decide who gets it.
Yep.
Whoever controls the food supply controls the people. And you have to kind of question, like, what are they going to do if they feel that power leaving them?
Yeah.
So, the last family we are going to discuss.
Let's go,
the Bush
Jeb.
family. Okay, there were a lot of memes. How many of you guys, show of hands, I mean, you aren't going to be able to see, how many of you saw the memes when Jeb was running for president?
One child
left behind when he brought the turtles.
That was so
Please
funny.
take it.
Please
clap.
Please
Please clap.
That was so funny.
Okay, when you see the memes of Jeb Bush, when he's saying please clap, that makes you feel sorry for him, right?
It just makes me laugh.
It made me feel sorry for him. I was like, oh my gosh, poor Jeb. I mean, his brother is George, and he can't even get people to clap.
The thing is they obviously just didn't know they were supposed to clap at that time. Because they're obviously, like, he was at some meeting or something with, like, his supporters.
Please clap.
And,
Please.
like, they just didn't realize that he was done.
My
Please
favorite
clap.
thing is when he brings those little turtle figurines.
Yeah.
And he was passing them out, and, like, no one wanted them. He's like, please take one. Oh, it was so funny.
Anyway.
So, when I think of Jeb and
We're
Bush
not
family,
here to talk about Jeb.
I think of, poor Jeb, please clap. This might change how you feel about them a little bit.
Well, you don't know how I feel about them.
How do you feel about them?
I'm not going to tell you. I'm reserving
Truthfully,
my
I don't
thoughts.
know how I feel about them.
I
because
don't really feel any way.
How old was I when George Bush was in office?
Anyways. Sorry.
So, of course, we know the two Bush men that have served as U.S. presidents.
George and George.
George and George. The two Georges.
Dub and H.
Yes. Well, it's H-W and then
Dub.
Yeah. Yes. So, obviously, Dub and H are father and son.
Dub and H-Dub.
Dub and H-Dub are father and son. And the Bush family, however, began their ascent to power and influence with Prescott Sheldon Bush. And he was a banker and a senator.
Of course. Another banker.
So in his college years, Prescott Sheldon was a member of a very secret society that has a lot of political ties at Yale. That society is the Skull and Bones Society. Many other members of the Bush family have been members of that club. So Prescott Sheldon Bush was also apparently behind a failed military coup against Franklin Roosevelt in 1933. So, many people believe that the Bush family profited in major ways from World War II and that they financially assisted companies with direct ties to Hitler.
We have another cat. Nova has now joined the podcast.
Hi, Bean.
This is a special episode. We got both conspiracy cats.
Conspiracy cats. If you're not watching on YouTube, you've got to, because we had Dom and Bean.
Yeah.
Hey, girlfriend. Anyways, Bush family may have financially assisted Hitler.
Oh.
Yeah, you missed that when Bean was jumping on your lap.
Yeah.
So Prescott Bush was the head of the Union Banking Corporation, which was a business that had known ties and business connections with Nazis. And so this led to the cooperation ultimately being impounded by the government. So the ties were so significant that they were impounded.
Wow.
So George H. Dubb is the son of Prescott Sheldon, and George Dubb is the grandson of Prescott Sheldon.
Yeah.
In case you're wondering. So, many supporters of many of the conspiracy theories surrounding the Bush family call members of the family the Bush League, Bush Buddies, or the Texas Taliban. Personally, I prefer Bush Buddies.
Texas Taliban is funny.
It sounds way harder than the other ones.
Than Bush Buddies? Yeah, it does.
Bush Buddies are like, you could call them the Bush Buddies
you go by
or
the Bush
Taliban.
Buddies, we go by the Texas Taliban.
I'm just
one
like,
or the other.
Dang. So the members of this group, the Bush Buddies, are supposedly both of the Georges, Jeb, as well as Jeb and George's brother Neil, Prescott, and great-grandfather George Herbert Walker. So we got 3 Georges, Jeb, Neil, and Prescott. So some of the claims that people make about the Bush Buddies, that they support Satanism through their membership and ties to the Skull and Bone Club, that they helped Osama bin Laden in his rise to power. There was a conspiracy organized by Jeb to rig the presidential election of 2000. Just seeing Jeb's own presidential campaign, I would be a little bit more hesitant to believe that one. Please clap. Jeb and George W. had a history of smuggling drugs, were blackmailed for it, and the person with the proof of the smuggling was killed to cover it up. And that they have the ultimate desire of achieving a totalitarian one-world government. So here are some spooky quotes that George W, he's the younger one.
George W.
George W. Here are some spooky quotes that George W. Bush has apparently said that make people kind of raise their eyebrows. So the first quote is, I told all 4 congressional leaders that there were going to be some times where we don't agree with each other, but that's okay. If this were a dictatorship, it'd be a heck of a lot easier, just so long as I'm the dictator.
But it's not a dictatorship.
It is not a dictatorship. Another quote that he said was, there ought to be limits to freedom, which is what he said when he was presented with news of an anti-Bush website.
Huh.
There ought to be limits to freedom.
So he's not a freedom of speech guy, huh?
Apparently not. So, okay.
My favorite Bush quote is, I don't really remember what he was talking about, but
Bush?
people are W. But he's people are asking him, I think, about the war, the Iraqi war, and he answers the question.
No, the war on terror. Just keep the war. It's not the war in Iraq. It's the war on terror. Just keep that in mind, because that's going to be something that's going to play into some more things.
Anyway, he's answers some question about it. He's on the golf course and he says, "Now watch this drive," and he hits the golf ball.
Are you telling me that's not spooky and unsettling? How was the drive?
I don't know.
Oh, okay.
I just know the quote.
There ought to be limits to freedom. If that doesn't put a chill on your spine, I don't know what will. Because that makes me feel like, ooh. So some people believe that George H.W. Bush was behind an assassination attempt on President Reagan in 1981. So he supposedly hired the gunman, John Hinckley, to attempt to shoot and kill the then president. So we know that Ronald Reagan survived. Like, he was not killed. So what was the reasoning behind the attempt? So apparently Bush was not pleased with Reagan's foreign policy, and Bush's desire was to shift towards a one-world government. And Reagan did not have the same kind of mindset. Bush was his VP at the time.
Hmm.
So if Reagan died, who would be president?
W.
HW.
Oh, HW.
HW. So if Reagan died, HW would be the president. So John Hinckley, the gunman, is the son of a known supporter of George H.W. Bush.
Hmm.
And his family had given a significant amount of money to H.W.
Hmm.
So there is another assassination that people claim H.W. is responsible for. In 1976, I almost said 1796. The conspiracy is that he is a vampire. In 1976, he was the head of the CIA, and theorists believe that he was responsible for the death of Orlando Letelier. I don't think I pronounced that right, but that's okay. Letelier. So you might think I've never heard of this man.
I haven't.
Okay. So Orlando Letelier was a Chilean diplomat and ambassador to the U.S., who was apparently very close with the president of Chile, Salvador Allende. So in 1973, the government of Chile was overthrown in a military coup and replaced by the regime of President Pinochet. So 3 years after this coup, Letelier was living in exile in Washington, D.C., when he was killed by a car bomb that was supposedly planted by members of the Chilean Secret Service. So people believe that Bush was working with the Chilean Secret Service in the operation that they had hatched to kill Letelier, which is something called Operation Condor. So Operation Condor was something that was executed by many of the South American dictatorships with the help of the U.S. government. So when you think of South America in like the 50s, 60s, 70s, you think of a lot of like communism, socialism, and that kind of thing. And this took place during the Cold War, Operation Condor did. And there was this huge fear of the growth of communism at the time. And there was also the goal of the U.S. that the countries remain friendly toward the U.S. government, which they wouldn't if they fell to communism. Obviously, there's a Cold War against the Soviet Union, which is communist, and Cuba was communist, so those countries were not like wanting to be buddies with the U.S. And so there was the concern that if they fell to communism, they would not be, so friendly to American requests. So Operation Condor ran from 1954 to 1983, and it led to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people, kidnappings, and assassinations, as well as thousands of people who disappeared and were never heard from again. So this operation ended when Argentina overthrew their government. And this was a horrible, tragic event that plagued South America, and many people from those countries are still struggling as a result. I watched a video that talked about it, and I admit I was kind of confused, so I didn't have a lot of information on here, but the comments were just full of people saying, I'm from, this country, and my family member was kidnapped and never seen again. And it was just full of people saying that they are still impacted by this because they lived during this time, or their family lived during this time. So the thing is, the government was Marxist. So when Orlando Letelier was, the diplomat and was the friend of the president, the government was Marxist. And they had been a democratically elected government. And so it came about, in the proper way. But there was a lot of pressure from other countries to remove the government, specifically from President Richard Nixon and his administration. So Bush has never spoken out about this to either confirm or deny its involvement or his involvement in this, and the CIA has refused to release any of the documents that may have shed light on this issue about his involvement in Operation Condor or whether he was involved in the death of Letelier. Both Bush presidents have had wars that started while they were in the White House, and both times there have been accusations that they directly profited from these wars. So the two of them had financial ties to two companies that made huge amounts of money during the wars, and these companies were called Halliburton and KBR. And people also suspect that George H.W. Bush was responsible for providing weapons and funds to Saddam Hussein when he was serving as vice president, and that was around the time where Saddam Hussein was rising to power. So one of the biggest theories about them is that they were responsible for the 9/11 terrorist attacks.
Yep.
Either by them directly planning the attack or allowing it to happen. I have had people ask me to do an episode on 9/11 many, many, many times.
It's like the biggest theory there is.
It's the theory that everyone wants to talk about.
It's like the most basic theory, I should say.
And for whatever reason, I just can't emotionally do it. I don't know why.
Okay.
But every time I start like researching it or talking about it, I get very emotional, and I don't know why. But so we're gonna talk about this a little bit. So the question is, why? Why would they do this? Like, this was a horrific tragedy. Why would they cause this to happen? So the theory is that they wanted to secure the oil pipeline routes that were located in Afghanistan by creating a reason to invade and begin a war. Because they couldn't just go in and start drilling.
Mm-hmm.
But if they went in a war because it was an act of retaliation,
there you go.
There you go. Other theories about their motives include taking away certain civil liberties from American citizens and beginning mass surveillance on U.S. citizens, as well as implementing a heavier hand when it came to foreign policy and relations. So, needing to gather intelligence about future terror attacks from nefarious ways has led to a big shift in how the public views the government. But many of these surveillance techniques were taken as a result of the idea that we as a country needed to be protected from any possible future attacks. Because it's true. I mean, we both lived during 9/11.
Yep.
You were younger, I was 6, and I remember I was in school when when it occurred. I watched it happen on TV, and I just remember how like emotionally devastating that was, and just they closed school early. They had us they wheeled in the TV and we watched it, and then all of us as a class just prayed about it until all of our parents came and picked us up, and then my mom had to come and talk to me and my sister about it. But we were children, so we don't really know what the public attitude toward the government was before that. We've only ever lived post 9/11 really as adults.
Even as a child, I mean, I was 4.
Right.
So
But I just remember
that
was a big shift in how, people saw the world and saw the government. And it also created this big fear that it might happen again.
Right.
I remember when I was in New York, we were on a double-decker bus going on the tour, and the tour guide said, double-decker buses are a huge target for terror attacks. I don't know why he would say that, because my mom almost told him to pull over, because something about my family is that we are scared of a lot of things.
Why would you say that?
If you know us personally, you know that Susan would have walked back to the hotel, but it's like people have this big fear. And so if you live near cities, like I lived near Seattle, and so I was always afraid that something might happen while I was downtown. And so there was this big fear of this could happen again. We don't want this to happen again. We need to make sure that we are aware of what terrorists are planning in case it happens again, so we can protect our citizens. So some of these ways of gathering information were kept secret from the public, such as wiretapping and recording phone calls from anyone who may be connected to terrorists. And it also created this sense of secrecy and the ability of the government to keep secrets from the public. There was no transparency between the government and the public. It was, we are looking for this and we are going to hide it from you. And you cannot know because it's not important for you to know, and we can't let our enemies know.
Right.
So one of the biggest things to come from this was the Patriot Act, which was passed in 2001, and it gave the government power to collect evidence that may be related to terrorism. Note how I say may be related to terrorism. So one of the most controversial parts of the Patriot Act was something called sneak and peek, which would give the government the ability to go into people's homes and search for evidence that they may be connected to terrorism without giving them any notice prior to the search. And of course you think, well, yeah, if you tell them you're coming, they're going to hide the evidence. Which is, I mean, I think it's fair. I mean, if someone is truly a terrorist and you're like, hey, Thursday at noon, I'm going to be at your house looking, then they're going to get the heck out of there. However, according to former U.S. Senator Russ Feingold, he was a critic of the Patriot Act, so kind of take what he says with a grain of salt. he said that only 1% of the cases in the Sneak and Peek Act were actually related to terrorism, and that the main effect of this act was giving the government a significant amount of power. And it's not a conspiracy that following the 9/11 attacks, there was a big shift in American culture. And I would say, like I said, it was one of the most influential events in American history, certainly in our lifetime. And 9/11 also had the effect of expanding the power of the executive branch. So if you know high school civics, the government has 3 branches: executive, judicial, and is legislative. So the executive branch is the president. So the power of the executive branch, or the president, would have been expanded. And theorists say that this could have been a reason behind the attacks in the first place, is to give the president the excuse to therefore then expand their power. Because they can't just go out and say, we need to expand power. We need to have surveillance of our citizens. Why? Why would they need that surveillance? Nothing was happening. Oh, something happens, and all of a sudden America is terrified, rightfully so, because it was a terrifying incident. And when people are scared, they are willing to give up more of their freedoms. And I think people have said this about COVID. When people are scared, people are willing to give up more to the government because the government says, I know how to help you. I know how to save you. I know how to protect you. Just do X, Y, and Z, and you will be protected. And so when people get scared, of course, they want someone to fix it. And they think, well, I'm not going to fix it. The government knows how to fix it. And this also led to the creation of a military act that was intended to give the military the power to go after terrorists. However, the legislation was vague and open for interpretation, which it has been over the years in a variety of military acts against terrorists. So a lot of these acts or things that were passed were kind of like, this is what they're intended for, but they're open to interpretation, so they have still been used even recently. I know recently this act was used, I believe it was President Biden, to attack Somalia. And so it's still being used because it's like, is this person maybe connected to terrorism? Okay, well, how do you know that? Because you've been wiretapping and surveillancing. I mean, we can talk all day about how the government is listening in on our phones and our devices. And a lot of people believe that this was the intended and desired effect from 9/11 by the Bushes. So currently, the Bush family is considered to be the most politically powerful family in the U.S. I mean, just think of it. We have had 2 presidents. We have had a presidential hopeful. George H.W. was the head of the CIA, and he was a vice president before becoming the president. And we have a number of senators as well. So supposedly, the younger Bush, George W. Bush, has sealed the presidential records of both himself and his father. I don't know if that's normal, but it doesn't seem normal. The Bush family also has a huge financial influence in the banking and oil industries.
Of course.
So, Ethan, as we conclude, what do you think of everything that we've discussed?
I don't know.
You don't know?
It's like so much information.
I've got you stumped.
It's just a lot of information. Yeah, they're all very powerful families. I don't really know what to say other than that.
Yeah. Do you think that there's anything that like particularly stuck out to you that you're like, oh, I buy this?
No.
Yeah. Of course, as wealth distribution changes and different people gain more wealth and power, these families might not be the 5 most powerful or most wealthy families anymore. But if you subscribe to the belief that there is this group of elites, they would certainly fall into that group. I do personally believe that these 5 families hold a lot of power, and that they have a huge amount of influence. I mean, the Bush family directly influencing the government by being the presidents. And I think that when you have the power to loan money to the government, that gives you a lot of power, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. People don't always do things who have power to benefit others. And so it kind of makes me kind of raise my eyebrows a little bit. and it's definitely concerning as well. And the fact that philanthropy gives people a cover to kind of cover up a lot of things, like the Rockefellers, page of how they're so charitable, they create all these hospitals while at the same time they're funding eugenics. So it kind of makes you wonder, like, how many other families are there out there that are like this, and what influence and power do they actually have in our lives? So that's a downer of a way to end the episode. Stay vigilant, guys. The government. Stay vigilant. As always, we want to know what you guys think of everything we've discussed. So leave us a respectful comment in the comment section down below. And, you know, share us on your socials and let us know what you guys think. Is there anything that we shared that kind of was like, whoa, okay, that stuck out to me, that made me think? We want to know. And we want to know if we've kind of inspired you to garden or something. I don't know. Not let the government control all your food. So yeah, thank you. And we'll be back in 1 week. Bye.
Bye.